So when Russ and I were talking about this service, I mentioned a story from my past, and I just got emotional connected to that. So we'll get through it. So, and he said, that sounds like a great reading. Why don't you write it up? So I did. 9 years ago, when I was running the free tax assistance program, I was totally crazed during tax season. My partner had been diagnosed with a heart problem and was spending most of her time in bed on oxygen. She had two things that she would save up her energy for. So every morning I would get up, I would start getting ready, and I would check in. Is there anything you need? And invariably, she would say no. So I'd finish getting ready. I'd poke my head in and say, okay, I'm leaving. And she said, could you do this one thing? And I would always say yes, and I would always be incredibly frustrated. But remember, I asked you, did you need anything? But I went to a meeting where someone was talking about their partner who would invariably leave the lights on in the room. And when they would come in and the lights were on, I was like, why can't you turn out the lights when you leave the room? And realized that that just caused frustration. So they remembered in 12-step programs, there's a saying that's called, bless them, change me. And they figured out, I could turn off the light myself and say, bless them, change me. So bell went off. So without talking about it, I scheduled myself to get up 15 minutes earlier. And then when 15 minutes before I needed to leave, I would say, I'm leaving. And she'd say, just, could you do this one thing? And I could say yes. And I could not feel guilty and not feel frustrated. And she died shortly after that. And I could know I didn't have that regret.
Russ, hold on one sec. One sec. So in honor of Palm Sunday, we usually, Jesus was a prophet, so we paved the way with palms, and since Jesus isn't actually standing here, the next best is the pastor. So I wanted to just kind of pave the way before you speak. And we can clean that up next Saturday. You can go now. You can go now.
Ryan, I need an ass.
We'll get to that in my sermon.
You have no friends. You have no enemies. You only have teachers. Now, if those words make you roll your eyes, that you're not alone. You may agree in principle, but the people are our teachers. But far too many of them don't use the compassionate, kind, gentle, loving approach. In my corporate career, there was one supervisor who was really quite famous. He was a micromanager. He belittled his employees. He would just ride them just mercilessly. And he was famous because he had a whole group of engineers, about 10 people, resign en masse all at once. This happened twice. And after the second time, he was reassigned to be a lone specialist, where he had no employees to be responsible for and worked on his own. Was this guy a teacher? Well, he was. He taught me what doesn't work when you supervise people. And one of my mentors way back then told me, it's essential to have a horrible boss early in your career. That way you learn how not to treat people. Then there are your parents, the people who raised you. Now, certainly these folks were and still are our teachers. But for many of us, we grew up putting our parents in that difficult person category. I was 65 years old before I forgave my mother and made peace with her. And that was 16 years after she had died. And I knew I'm not alone because one of our most popular adult religious classes was titled Making Peace with Your Mother. Very well attended. Then other difficult people, there's a fountainhead phase of emotional wounds, your childhood. Most of the emotional scars that what we carry, come from some childhood event, some childhood trauma, rejection, not fitting in a relationship. And children can be so cruel to each other. Sometimes the cruelest place is the elementary playground at recess when the adults aren't around. And now that cruelty arena has been expanded beyond the playground to social media. It is really amazing that anyone survives childhood. So there are numerous encounters with difficult people from your family, your schooling, your work environment, your social environment, and maybe with time and energy and a lot of therapy for some of us, we can see that people who we view as being difficult are really our opportunities for self-examination. Maybe the universe is putting them in our lives for our own spiritual growth. Maybe when we're triggered by an irritating person, this is a blessed moment when we are offered another rung on the spiritual ladder. Or maybe, you've heard this metaphor, when life hands you a bunch of lemons, you want to freeze them and throw them as hard as you can at the people who are irritating you. I believe the measure of my soul is the capacity to love imperfect people. Truth is, we're surrounded by imperfect people. Truth is, we're all imperfect. Immanuel Kant said it this way: out of crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Now, but by accepting our flaws and imperfection and accepting that everyone is made of crooked timber, that's only the beginning. Because beyond acceptance, we need to lean in and see what lessons are being offered. Here's an important caveat in my message today. There are some people who are too difficult to imagine as a teacher or a gift. If someone is abusing you physically or emotionally, stay away and seek help. Some people are dangerous and you need to stay away. But I hope that most of the people that you encountered are at best entertaining and at worst irritating. So when dealing with difficult people, you have a choice of throwing frozen lemons or remaining as calm as possible, using our emotional response as a doorway into our own shadow side. So we may learn and grow. We have a choice of dealing with difficult people by saying, please change yourself so I can feel better. Or just realizing that idiots are sent to trigger us. They give us valuable opportunities to deprogram our automatic responses. Now, we only label people as an idiot when they trigger a specific sensation in us. It's our reaction to the sensation that causes us to label them an idiot. So in place of reacting, just try and experience the sensation for what it is. The sensation will pass. And then maybe you can see the lesson presented to you by this teacher. I've tried this. I've tried that. And you know what happens? I'm encountering fewer and fewer idiots. And just to be clear, I'm not talking about any of you or our Zoom congregation. The bottom line is that we're all difficult people. We all make mistakes. We all sin. We all have regrets in our relationships where we hurt another person. The good news, we're more alike than different. We all have similar needs. And maybe that's what Jesus meant when he said, love your neighbors as yourself. He's asking us to see the divine in everyone. Now, you've heard it already. This is Palm Sunday. And I really started worrying, like, what kind of childhood did Jesus have? Well, the Christian Bible doesn't say much about the early parts of Jesus' life. There's the birth story, of course, that's well known. And then there's nothing until Jesus shows up in the temple at the Pharisees in Jerusalem when he's 12. And then there's another huge gap where there's nothing really until he starts his ministry, which was around age 30. So all we can do is imagine. But the Gospel of Mark and Matthew mentions that Jesus had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Jr., Simon, and Jude, and 2 unnamed sisters, because the women don't get mentioned much in the Bible. That's a family of 7 siblings, plus parents. That's 9 people in a household. Now, if you were raised in a large family, you know something about living with difficult people. Your family knows where all your trigger buttons are because they put them there. I really think that Jesus knew about difficult times, difficult people, and yet he didn't become an angry person. And his ministry continues to inspire over 2,000 years later. Why? Because in part, it's the way he handled difficult people. He asked a lot of questions when he was confronted. He knew when to walk away from a crowd. He was never defensive in his responses, and he was extremely flexible in dealing with people. I believe that Jesus was the embodiment of the ultimate teacher because he was the embodiment of a lifelong learner who learned from everyone. There's a saying that things don't happen to you, they happen for you. The challenge in our relationships are an offering, a gentle tap on the shoulder to remind us to be open to the learning when we get caught. It's a holy moment when we turn our attention from the other to ourselves. It's a holy moment when we turn the attention from the other to ourselves. Then the magic starts to happen. Amen, and blessed be so.
This palm path for him, but I accidentally made like a dirt path for me going to the pulpit. So hopefully that doesn't say much. Everybody eat. So I don't want anybody to fall asleep. You guys stand up. We're going to switch gears from Russ to Ryan. So I want everybody to stand up and do a circle. Turn around. Yes, wave your hands, get the blood flowing, and we will dive back in. All right. Fun. Many a year ago, back in the pre-COVID world, when people actually shopped and showed up to church in person, thank you guys for coming in person today, there was a prolific new pastor entering his first call in a Universalist Unitarian world. We'll call him, I don't know, Reverend Russ for shits and giggles. Needless to say, having come from a successful business background, the pulpit, though filled with purpose and promise, wasn't quite as profitable as your average Silicon Valley tech job. Thus, Reverend Russ and his lovely wife needed to cut back on frivolous expenses a little bit. Struggling early on to make ends meet, the pastor was livid when he came home one day and he saw his wife wearing a $500 designer dress. How could you do such a thing? He's asked in this exalted tone. It's not my fault, said the well-dressed wife. I was outside a store minding my own business, meandering Pacific Avenue, when I caught sight of that dress in the window. And I wasn't planning on buying it, but I couldn't help but just go in and try it on. However, when I looked in the mirror, I heard Satan whispering in my ear, "You look fabulous in that dress, buy it." Well, Reverend Russ replied, "You know how I deal with that kind of temptation. I say, get behind me, Satan." The wife looked up with humbled eyes. "I did," replied his wife. But then Satan said, "It looks fabulous from back here too." In the Christian church, the disciple Peter often came across as one of Jesus's favorites. Now, I know what you're thinking. God doesn't play favorites. However, Peter, the disciple that walks on water, was special. His name alone, Peter, Kephas in Greek, literally meant the rock, for he was the one of which would serve as the cornerstone of the church for millennia to come. On an interesting aside, is anyone else perplexed as to why the only disciple to walk on water was also the one that was synonymous with the rock? It just, I don't know. Irony aside, we all like that passage. It's a power passage when Peter defies physics and steps out onto the sea to meet Jesus. However, today, Palm Sunday in the Christian season of Lent, I'm putting on my Presbyterian pastoral cap so as to focus on two other interactions between Christ and the supposed cornerstone that show the more human side of Peter, each from the New Testament's Gospel of Matthew. First, coming from Matthew 16, pits Peter in conversation with Jesus about the plans God has for the Messiah. No, the disciple says in opposition to his friend and teacher's faithful foreshadowing of his crucifixion. I don't like the whole torturous death or descending into hell thing, he argues. What do you say we aim for a happier ending? Can you really blame Peter for his inability to see the situation past every man's eyes and through the lens of the divine? We wouldn't wish a slow death and descent into the underworld on even the most difficult people in our lives, let alone the one of whom we admire and aspire. Never, Lord, Peter said in response, this shall not happen to you. That's when Jesus catches us off guard. No loving assurance offered. Instead, Jesus turned to Peter and shouts, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." How's that for a friendly reply? Next time someone worries about you or shows up at home in a beautiful dress that you can't quite afford, just belittle the Beelzebub out of them. Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance. That word hindrance is of special focus today as we speak about difficult people. And who is more difficult than the hot-headed horned heathen from the fiery underworld? Hindrance. When scanning various translations of Matthew's gospel and researching today's sermonette, it seemed that there are actually a variety of colorful words interchanged over the centuries to depict difficulty and devilishness. Stumbling block, tempter, offender, adversary, pick your poison. But all said, Jesus is not literally deeming that his disciple grew horns. He is simply saying, get out of the way. Stop focusing on your immediate emotions and present pleasantries. Forget how that dress or suit looks in the mirror. These are worldly things. Instead, open your eyes to eternity. And in such, you might open yourself up to a momentary discomfort or difficulty. No, we don't like difficult people. Those who hinder our pace of life, our pursuit of happiness, or our feeling of purpose in the present. The words and actions of these people often seem adversarial, but not their person. For as often is the case, the adversarial voices that meet us along the way are often spoken out of passion and love and concern. And like Peter, we all play adversary now and again, or are teased by the voice of doubt that we bear within. But worry not, this is not a sign of damnation so much as an opportunity for evolution. Let's pause briefly to break down the term Satan. And note that I didn't say name. The word in Hebrew, Satan, simply means adversary. And as we enter the final week of the 40-day Lenten season leading up to Easter this Palm Sunday morning, I turn briefly to Jesus' final temptation days in the desert, spelled with one S, not two, as Lent is also a time of fasting from things like dessert. At this point, Jesus has been, now you get it, yeah. At this point, Jesus has been in the desert, or more accurately, the wilderness, for 40 days as part of his own initiation, when he comes across an adversary, a difficult deity of sorts that we call Satan, who attempts to seduce him 3 times over. Now make note of that. Next time that you throw a 4-letter word up to the heavens in response to being tempted and tested, and we're not talking about love here, remember that Jesus went first, and a little more intensely than we did. So Satan's first 2 temptations are each preceded by the same phrase, if you are the Son of God. This is significant because it demonstrates that our primary temptation that we all face is to doubt our own divine identity. This is what Peter did in questioning God's plan for Jesus, and does again in the passage that we'll end today on. The adversary in our lives is often that of whom makes us question our own divinity. And this is where most of us fall apart. We can think of any number of reasons to condemn or devalue ourselves, to tap out when times get tough. However, the primary temptation that we have to overcome lies in not doubting our divine identity. Because once we doubt that, it's all downhill from there. So let's move on to the actual temptations. First is the misuse of power. Maybe we could say it's a temptation of the ego, a temptation to be spectacular. Because who doesn't desire to be special, important, and showy? The tempter says, tell these stones to become bread. We all want to do something miraculous, to prove ourselves, to gain recognition. But Jesus refuses to play that game. So a second temptation. The devil took him to the holy city and made him stand on the very pinnacle of the temple. And he tells Jesus, throw yourself down, for if you're the Son of God, remember that line, then God will save you. Thus, the second great temptation is to misuse religion by playing games with God. Been there, done that. How many times this week alone have I challenged God? God, if you're real, grant me a raise, a vacation, good health. God, if you're real, you'd help the homeless man on the street corner and make the Tennessee Volunteers March Madness champions. Well, we lost that. I lost my pool, but we did beat the Duke Blue Devils. But Jesus says, I'm not going to play the religious game either, because religion that our adversaries suggest is transactional as opposed to transformational. It's the falsified, institutionalized faith that the contemporary culture shuns when claiming spiritual, not religious. To be sure in our faith means to have faith without knowing, not to demand proof or push our faith on another as a way to alleviate our own uncertainties. So finally, the third temptation, that of political power. I'll give you divine dominion if you follow me, taunts Satan. Now, out of fear of mixing religion and politics, I won't touch on that one because Lord knows there's no power-hungry people in the political system. It's important to note that these temptations, nor the difficult, hindering voices that speak them in our lives, are not inherently wrong. We are human after all, and we act on emotions and immediacy. Furthermore, there are ways which we can use power for good. But until we accept that political power is trumped by spiritual trust, we must always misuse it. It's interesting how one word, trump, actually serves as the best means of describing the misuse of political power in our sentence, as well as the primary example of political power misuse in our country. We should all aspire to have our name be a pun. So with that, Jesus passes the test of temptation. He addresses the most difficult of difficult people, and he bumps into a lot of them in his 30-some-odd years. From the strict Sadducees to the pain-in-the-butt Pharisees, Judas to Pontius Pilate, and plenty others. And he does so by listening to each and staying true to his own values, identity, and not meandering from his divinely directed path, despite the opposition he encounters along the way. So to close, we turn to the second interaction with the difficult disciple, Peter. Now, Peter was sitting in the courtyard, and a servant girl came to him. "You were with Jesus of Galilee," she said, but he denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, "This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth." He denied it again with an oath, "I don't know the man." After a little while, those standing there went to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." And Peter says, "I don't know the man." And immediately a rooster crowed, and Peter remembered the words Jesus had spoken. "Before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times over." And he went outside and wept bitterly. Point being, no matter how difficult the situation, the difficult the people, or the pursuit of your personal passion and purpose is, never deny or doubt your own divinity. The difficult situations and the people we encounter along the way often hinder our prescribed paths. However, many times these are opportunities to step out of our own desires and take a divine detour. Hear every voice and give attention, love, and respect to everyone you encounter. But never allow them to diminish your personal divine nature nor dim your shine. Instead, love the Lucifer out of them and love yourself because you are beautiful and worthy. And when seeing the holy in your heathenist fellow human hindrances is a little intimidating, a little too intense, remember that even Satan was an angel first. It's always inside. Amen.